Have you ever given much thought as to how risk changes in your investments when you're in retirement? Well, if not, stay tuned to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. And welcome to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, of course, here with my good friend and co-host, Sarah Samuels. And today we're talking about risk, and risk in a way that might actually surprise you. Because when it comes to your investments, there are different types of risk and different ways to look at risk. And frankly, it's different from when you're in your accumulation years, like Sarah, maybe versus your transition years, like myself, or retirement, like some of you folks. So, Sarah, we got a great show here today. Good to see you as usual.
It's good to see you too, Dave. And of course, it's great here. It's great to be here with all of our listeners. And I think risk is such an important topic, especially thinking about the different types of risk and when it comes to your investments, and thinking about the different types of risk depending on what phase of life you're in. As you always say, Dave, you've got to be flexible. You've got to be adaptable in each stage of life, each stage of your career. And then pre-retirement, it comes with its own set of risks.
That's right. So most people know that risk, as a general rule, as you get older, you want to take less risk, right? When you're younger, maybe you take a little more risk. But then risk also is a personality thing, okay? Like take you and Justin, for example, okay? It's one of you, I could let our audience guess, is willing to take a little more risk than the other one. And which one is that, pray tell?
Well, surprisingly, I would say I'm the more riskier one when it comes to activities and things like that. I'm kind of a daredevil, but he is actually a bit riskier than I am, I would say, in financial
when it comes
investments.
To investments, yeah.
Because he loves investing in cryptocurrency and NFTs, all these crazy things he talks about all the time, which I personally feel a little risky because I don't understand them entirely. But yes, we're both risky in different ways.
You have to go home and knock some sense into that boy.
I know. That's another story.
So risk is, important to the stage of life, right?
Right.
It's important. It depends upon how much money you have, but it also depends upon what you're risking, right? Are you risking seeing a lump sum drop on paper, for example? Or are you risking something where your income in retirement could actually drop? Because there's a big difference, Sarah, for a lot of our listeners, that it's one thing to see something drop on paper emotionally. It's another thing when it literally affects your paycheck in retirement, right?
Right.
So I think we need to differentiate the risk of your lump sum dropping versus the risk of your income dropping. And also talk about the logical side of risk, like when on paper it's okay to take more risk versus when it's not, but also the emotional side of it, because the emotions affect our propensity to spend, right? I mean, the Fed knows this, right? The Fed knows that, when the stock market has a major drop, it can actually cause a recession, right? We talked about this before. People think, well, when there's a recession, then the stock market drops. So the reality is, stock market drops, your 401k drops, it's worth less, you don't feel like spending as much, and that causes a recession. So we have to talk about that emotional aspect of it also.
And plus the fact too, Dave, that like you just, with your example with Justin and me, you might have a riskier personality, but it doesn't always translate to how you want to be with your investments.
True.
So there's that battle as well. But let's get into our Ask Dave question. This comes from Cameron out in West Virginia. Cameron, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave email. Cameron says, stocks outperform in the long run, Dave. So I think I should still be in stocks in retirement. What do you think?
Well, Cameron, you certainly can be, and having some money in stocks in retirement makes sense. And I don't know how close you are to retirement, Cameron, but so yes, it's okay. But the real issue becomes, how you're generating your income in retirement. In other words, are you in higher dividend stocks where you can survive off the dividend? If so, then maybe having a little bit more in stocks in retirement is good. The problem, Cameron, is a lot of advisors today and a lot of do-it-yourself investors don't invest in the stock market for yield, for income. They invest in the stock market for total return. So what they're really trying to do is they're really thinking about, I need to sell some shares. I need to use what we call the withdrawal method to engineer retirement income. That over time the market goes up, so I can just sell some shares, I can liquidate, take systematic withdrawals, and I'll be okay. And that's where staying too heavily invested in stocks in retirement can be a really slippery slope. So again, if you have the right risk tolerance and it's high dividend stocks, okay, maybe that's okay. But if it's not and you're depending upon that for income, then you better think twice. But Cameron, stay tuned because we're going to talk more about the problems with the withdrawal method and why really the income method is the only way to safely earn retirement income from your investments.
And Cameron, again, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners or even our YouTube viewers out there have a question or a topic that you'd like Dave to answer or maybe even cover on a future show, all you have to do is send us an email at askdave@retirementincomesource, SOURCE.com. And thank you for spending time here with us today on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton. And we're talking about this theme of risk, all the different types of risk, the risk of your lump sum dropping, but also this risk of perhaps your income being affected. So Dave just answered a question from Cameron in West Virginia, Ask Dave question, where Cameron seemed to be really referencing this withdrawal method. And it sounded like Cameron has been educated by the Wall Street cheerleaders out there, as we call
Perhaps,
them,
yes.
the financial advisors that they say these kinds of things like stocks always outperform in the long run, or, oh, this method is very safe. It's a 90% chance, right, of you not running out of money. So, Dave, can you explain what's the big problem here with the withdrawal method?
Well, the biggest problem with the withdrawal method is just that. You're withdrawing principal, and you're hoping that you don't run out. And, if you get lucky and you retire in a bull market, and the bull market lasts for a while, then the withdrawal method could work. If you get unlucky and retire in a bear market, then it won't work. Great example, right? The first 13 years of this century, if somebody retired in January of 2000 with $1 million, and they were trying to take, just in the stock market, the S&P 500, right, the Fortune 500 companies, and they tried to withdraw $40,000 a year, well, only 14 or 15,000 of that would have come from dividends. The other 25,000 or so would have come out of principal. But what would your account have been worth 13 years later? Would have been worth about $500,000. It'd be worth about half. So now you have to imagine, okay, you're only 13 years into retirement. Maybe you're still in your 70s. Maybe you're really healthy and good shape. And guess what? You just spent down half your money. Why? Because you were unlucky and you retired in a bad stock market. And nobody knows whether the market's going to be up or down in the first few years of retirement. Yeah. So that's why when Cameron says something like, okay, over the long run, the stock market outperforms, sure, over the long run. But my question, Sarah, is always, has anybody told you what the long run really is? Because again, the first 13 years of this century, the stock market spent its life underwater. And the fact that it happened once, Sarah, tells us it can what?
It's going to happen again. Probably, most likely will happen again.
It could happen again. In fact, it happened 3-4 times in the last century,
right,
in the 20th century, and once already in the 21st. So again, that's a long time. So when you say the stock market outperforms in the long run, we're talking about 20-year periods. Now, that's all great, but when you retire, you've got to say, if I retire in my 60s, how many go-go years do I have left, right? Where I'm going to go and travel and I'm going to enjoy my money and do fun things. If you're lucky, it's 20. If you're really lucky, for many people, it's less than that, right? So you got to realize that you don't have the time on your side when you retire like you did when you were younger.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's what I want to talk more about that and the problems with the withdrawal method. And you mentioned this 90% chance of success. So if you're wondering what Sarah meant when she's asking about, gosh, there's a 90% chance of success, well, stay tuned. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton. And today's show is all about the different types of risk to your principal or to your lump sum, and even the different types of risk associated with your income. So we just talked about one of the big risks when it comes to retirement, and that is if you're with a financial advisor who is using the withdrawal method. Dave touched on a few reasons why that's so problematic, and the biggest reason is timing the market. You're not sure what the markets results are going to look like in the future. It's very difficult as no one has a crystal ball to be able to time the markets. And Dave, I also mentioned that a lot of advisors, they pitch these 90% successful plan rates that you're, guaranteed or 90% guaranteed to not run out of money within a certain time frame. So why is that an issue? And what are some of the other issues associated with the withdrawal method?
Well, the problem, Sarah, actually, is that they don't explicitly pitch it as a 90% success plan.
Oh, right. Well, that's in the small print, right?
That's in the small print, or that's something that we know behind the scenes. But that's the problem with the withdrawal method. When you're withdrawing from principal, you never know how long your money's going to last. You never know how long you're going to live. You never know what the markets are going to do. So you have to back test it. So what a lot of financial advisors will do is use software. It's all based upon some type of mathematics called Monte Carlo analysis. Now that sounds really pretty and really fancy, right? Yeah. But what it really does is just run through a whole bunch of 20 or 30-year periods historically and say, hey, if we can put you at an income rate, a rate of withdrawal, and let's say 4% was the old rule, right? So
that's
you get
a safe amount you can take out each year.
It used to be, right? It used to be, yeah. So you got $1 million, you're taking out $40,000 a year, given a certain allocation. What's the chance that I don't run out of money? And for most advisors, again, they don't advertise this, but if that chance gets over 90%, they're good. They're like, okay, this is good. This plan's most likely going to work for my clients. The problem is if they were really explicit and they said, hey, Sarah, I want you to sign over your life savings to us right here. I've got all the paperwork ready. I just want to let you know before you sign it over that if you invest with us, there's a 10% chance you're going to run out of money. So go ahead and sign right here. Press hard. There's 3 copies. Am I going to get you as a client that day if I'm that explicit?
Probably not, Dave. I think you have to soften your approach a little bit. But still, I have to say the 10%, that sounds pretty good. 90% success sounds good.
Well, it sounds good as long as it's something major, right? I mean, the chance of playing Russian roulette and taking the bullet, right, is 1 out of 6. It's 16%. But you don't see people running around playing Russian roulette because the odds of taking the bullet are low, right? Because it's not just a question of the odds, it's a question of how bad the outcome is. So when the outcome is death, well, people don't want to play that game even if the percentage is low. If the odds are financial death, and most people knew that 10% meant financial death, they wouldn't play that game either. And I think that's important for people to realize. And by the way, the 4% is an old rule. Right now, there's different studies that show really on $1 million, you can only safely take $27,000 a year, maybe 30, 35. Yeah. And when I say safely, that's still subject to that somewhat of a chance of running out of money. So,
well, that's why I love your example, Dave, about losing half your $1 million in just 13 years, depending on when you're retired in the market. So let's get into our next Ask Dave question. So we have Stuart from California. Stuart says, my advisor, says I should have about 60% or so in stocks and retirement. But to be honest, I'm just not that comfortable with that much risk. So, Dave, this Ask Dave question from Stuart sounds very similar to our last Ask Dave question from Cameron. Yeah, but a little different.
It's different, but this is good because, I think Cameron was coming at it from more of a left brain standpoint. Like, okay, shouldn't I have more stocks because I'm living longer, was kind of what I read between the lines. In Stuart's case, it's more of an emotional thing. It's saying, okay, my advisor says I can afford to take more risk, but I'm not emotionally comfortable with it. And Stuart, that's important because you have to be able to sleep at night. You have to feel comfortable. People don't, people won't spend their money if they're not comfortable, right? We talked before about how if all of a sudden the stock market takes a major drop and, as we used to say, the 401k turns into a 201k, right? And you have less money, that, all of a sudden people don't want to spend. It actually causes a recession. Now, we're not worried about causing a recession, right, Stuart? You're worried about your money, a personal recession for you. But the same is true. And if you know that's going to cause pucker factor, then you probably want to be really careful with that. You want to take less risk. I always ask people, Stuart, what's the most you're willing to take on paper? And think about it in dollars, right, in terms of a drop. So if you have $1 million, are you willing to see the account drop to 900? Does that feel okay? 800, 700, 600? Where's your pain point where you say enough is enough? And you have to really know where that pain point is so that you can properly assess your emotional risk. So it might say on paper, you've got a huge pension, Social Security, you've got a ton of money, you can take risk, right? But it's not all about paper. It's about how you feel and how it's going to affect your enjoyment of retirement.
Yeah. Well, Stuart, thank you so much for emailing us and sending in your question for Dave to answer. And if anyone out there, any of our listeners or viewers, our YouTube viewers out there, have a question that you want Dave to answer, you can send us an email too. Just email us at askdave@Retirement Income Source. That's SOURCE.com. Thank you for spending your listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton, and we are talking about all of the different types of risk when it comes to both your investments and, of course, the emotional aspects of risk, and how it's really hard to know what it feels like unless you live through it. And Dave, you've mentioned the Worth Avenue example, where after Bernie Madoff made off with a lot of people's money in Palm Beach, and these people were multimillionaires, some of them billionaires, but they had taken a big loss. So psychologically, these folks who could afford it now, they were not out there on Worth Avenue shopping. They weren't doing anything because they were scared. They were nervous. They were freaked out by the big loss that they took.
Yeah, and for those who aren't from Southern Florida, Worth Avenue is like the Rodeo Drive of Palm Beach, right? Yeah. And Sarah, you're right. There are people there that are multi-millionaires, even billionaires. And they didn't give all their money to Bernie Madoff. Yeah. Maybe they gave a third of it to Bernie Madoff, right? So maybe they had $60 million and their net worth suddenly dropped to $40 million. Well, you remember my story about the day I was there with a friend of mine, a builder, and we were looking at distressed properties maybe to go and invest and do some things because the economy had softened a little bit. Yeah. And all of a sudden it just hit me that it was Saturday afternoon and no one was on Worth Avenue shopping. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, if these people, if they had a $60 million net worth and they had a third of it with Bernie Madoff and now their net worth dropped from 60 to 40, well, Sarah, I mean, let me ask you, if you're worth $40 million, can you afford to shop on Worth Avenue, yes or no?
I don't know, Dave. I gotta pinch my pennies. No, I'm just kidding. If I have that much money, of course I could shop there.
Of course you can. Yeah. And these people probably shopped at Worth Avenue when they were worth 20 and 30 million, but on the way up. Because when your net worth is growing, it feels good. It feels like you want to spend. Things are going well. You're making progress. Human beings want to make progress. They don't want to go backward in any part of life. They always want to go forward. So if you're moving forward, even if you're at a lower net worth, you're going to spend. But if you're moving backward at a higher net worth, you're likely not to spend. Because it's not so much about the level of wealth, it's about the direction of wealth. And I think it's important that you realize this as you're assessing your personal risk, because even if you think you don't need that money at all, again, you're blessed with a huge pension, lots of income that you can never outlive, great Social Security benefits, you're not going to spend it all, still, you have to say, am I going to enjoy even that income if I've just seen my net worth get cut in half, right? It happened twice, 2013. Market dropped by half, recovered, dropped by more than half, right? So, again, the fact that it happened twice tells us it can what?
It's going to happen again, or it will probably happen again, exactly. Yeah. And most people, Dave, they're really not prepared emotionally, to take that big loss, even if they haven't lived through it, especially. A lot of times as human beings, we tend to underestimate things unless they've happened to us, and then we can empathize a little bit better. So I think that's another big risk. If you haven't lived it, then it's difficult to understand what it actually feels like.
Yeah, and it's important, it's important to really assess why you have your money, right? For most people, you got to really drill down and figure out emotionally what it does for you. Does it give you security? Does it give you a sense of freedom? Does it give you a sense of flexibility? Okay. For a lot of men, it defines them, right? Some men are defined by being good athletes or good lovers, right? And some are defined by being financially successful, right?
Right.
Maybe they were and not always, a lot of women say are the primary breadwinners, but I mean, maybe someone is a primary breadwinner of the family, and that's where they get their sense of net worth. And now if all of a sudden their net worth drops by 30, 40, 50%, they feel like they failed not just themselves, but failed their spouse. So that's why you got to think about what the money really means to you on a core level.
Yeah. So we've talked about what happens or what if your principal drops, but what are some of the other type of risks that you need to be concerned about? Well, we are going to discuss those next. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton, and today we're talking all about risk and the different risks you might face when it comes to your principal, the different risks when it comes to your investments, and really the types of risks you need to be concerned about when it comes to income. So, Dave, can you tell us what are some of the things that might affect your income, particularly in retirement?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you're working, your risk to income is really getting laid off, losing your job, right? That's it. And you don't think about it that much because it's always a risk, and it is what it is. You think of risk with your money as lump sum, right? We call it the 401k brain, where if you get your statement and your 401k is up month over month, you feel good about it. If it's down, you feel bad about it. But in retirement, as we say every single week, it's all about the income. So Social Security, right? If you're married and one spouse dies before the other, well, then that Social Security is going to get reduced. One of those benefits will go away. If you have a traditional pension plan, the old defined benefit plans that give you income for life, depending upon which option you take at retirement, that income could very well go down. It can go away or get reduced. So now imagine the standard option with a pension, Sarah, where it's called a 50% joint and survivor option, where you might get $50,000 a year. But if you predecease Justin, he'll only get half that. He'll only get $25,000 a year. Well, now if you die first, he loses half the Social Security benefit. He loses half the pension. That's a big loss of income, right? Yeah. So Social Security and pensions are great examples. Or even rental property. You have rental property and you get vacancies for a while. Yeah. That's a loss of income.
Yeah. But how does it apply specifically to your investments, Dave?
Well, in the investment world, you've got things that guarantee income. You've got, government bonds that guarantee income for the life of the bond, right? For the only way it fails if the government fails. You've corporate bonds that are guaranteed by the corporation. So as long as the corporation is sound, you're good. The income's not going to change. Annuities, of course, guarantee income. Now, there's a catch there because when annuities guarantee income, they're sending you principal and interest. So they're using the withdrawal method. The only difference is they're using the withdrawal method, but they're ensuring that if you live to be 110, they're going to pay you for the rest of your life no matter what. So it's like a withdrawal method with an insurance policy. And then there are things like stocks, right? And the beauty about stocks is with healthy companies, over time, the dividend should actually go up. But we all know that sometimes dividends can go down. And that's a risk to your income. So what people aren't used to thinking about, when people diversify, they diversify by, investment type and by risk, but they don't think about diversifying their investment income sources. How much of their income is contractual? How much of their income really is not contractual? And how much of their income might be indirect contract? Indirect contract are things like bond funds or real estate investment trusts or BDCs.
Yeah. Well, this kind of leads to our Ask Dave question here. We have Robert in Minnesota. And Robert seems like he's a pretty risky guy. Maybe he's a daredevil. Maybe he likes skydiving on the weekends. Because Robert says, Dave, I remember the financial crisis and I didn't really lose sleep over it. So I think I'd prefer to stay more aggressive in my investment strategy in retirement. What do you think?
So, Robert, I don't know how old you are. I don't know if you're retired or anything, but I do know one thing. You were probably working in 2008 when we had the financial crisis 15 years ago. And today, if not retired, you're closer to retirement. And again, risk changes when you retire. And if you lived through it, it was probably because you didn't need that money. It didn't mean anything to you, right? You had your paycheck. Your paycheck was coming in every week. And okay, it was just loss on paper. Maybe you became a little numb to it and it wasn't a big deal. And it does eventually come back. But when you retire and you need that money to drive income, now it's a different story. And even if you're retired and don't need that money to drive income, Robert, it still feels different, right? How it feels once you give up your paycheck is, when you see a loss on paper, is much more severe than how it feels when you're still working. And, I can give you a great example. I had a client of mine in the 1980s, actually, that had $6 million, and he had all municipal bonds at 6%. Municipal bonds are considered to be pretty secure. And he was only spending $150,000 a year. So, Robert, if you do the numbers real quick, you say 6% of $6 million, that's $360,000 per year tax-free. But he was worried. He was paranoid about running out of money. He kept asking me to do illustrations and projections and everything. And this is in the 80s. I was a young financial advisor, and I couldn't figure out why, because he's only spending less than half of that money. It was clear to me he was never going to run out of money. And he said to me, Dave, you don't understand because you're in your 20s. When you're used to getting a paycheck and supporting your family every year, you get that paycheck, you spend some, you save some, and that's it. It changes when you retire. And when I'm about to give up my career now and retire and need this money for income, it's a worrisome feeling. So I understand from a left brain standpoint that I'm going to be okay, but I just need that assurance. I don't feel like I'm okay. And Sarah, the irony about this was this particular guy was an executive at a major company, real smart guy, but he was reacting emotionally because his emotions changed at that stage of life.
Yeah. Well, I think just that transition, even going from working to retirement, that's a tough enough emotional transition. And then when you throw in the risk and losing sleep over investments, it's a whole different story. So, Robert, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners, our YouTube viewers out there, if you have a question for Dave, maybe there's a show topic you'd like to see us cover, please send it in to us via email at askdave@retirementincomesource. That's SOURCE.com. And thank you so much for listening to us right here on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton, and we're talking about risk and all the different ways that risks can affect you when it comes to your investment, it's when it comes to your lump sum, your principal, and really the emotional aspects of risk and how this transition to retirement, in my opinion, and of course I haven't gone through it, but it seems like it's very, very difficult to psychologically deal with. And then on top of that, the stress or the worry about maybe I'm going to run out of money, or maybe I'm not making as much money as I could be in retirement. It's a lot.
Well, we talked on other shows, Sarah, how, just the life transition is a big deal, right? It's like, what am I going to do? I spend 8 hours a day plus at work, plus commuting, plus thinking about work, right?
Right.
Now there's a huge void in my schedule. So we always encourage people to come up with all kinds of fun things they want to do in retirement. So they're not moving away from maybe a job they don't like. They're moving towards something that they truly desire. Right. Well, that's great, but it's a real letdown if you're moving toward that and all of a sudden your income drops. You're retired and your income drops, or maybe your income doesn't drop, but maybe you're in high dividend stocks or bonds and bond-like instruments, but your lump sum drops and now you don't feel like doing all those fun things. Now, if you have a day to fill with activities, but you don't have the money, in some ways you probably wish you didn't retire. You wish you had gone back to work.
Right. You wish you were still working, especially, Dave, because people don't want to go backwards, like you said. Once you retire, most people out there, they want to stay retired. They don't want to have to go back into the workforce.
That's right. That's right. And so it's important to really, number one, to realize that, like my client, his name was Ed, right? The bottom line is, unless you've experienced a major market drop as a retiree, well, then you haven't experienced one. Even if you think you have, you haven't. It's a different set of emotions. And you have to take the time to sit there and close your eyes and say, if my million goes to 900, am I okay? If it goes to 800, am I okay? How am I going to feel? Am I going to feel like I'm losing security? How's my spouse going to feel?
Right? Yeah. If it's not just you in your retirement, right? Your partner, your life partner.
That's right. Am I going to lose flexibility? Am I going to lose adventure, enjoyment? What does it mean to me? And then, how much of that, based upon that, do I want to have my income from insured instruments versus non-insured instruments? Non-insured instruments like stocks obviously give you more growth potential in lump sum, but also more growth potential in the dividend, the income. But it can go away. So like a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll look at their I need goals in retirement when they're painting the picture for what retirement's going to look like, which, by the way, if you're thinking about retiring, you haven't painted the picture, big mistake, paint the picture, okay? We've done shows on this. I think we need to do another show on this probably coming up soon. I think it's important. Yeah. But, they'll say, okay, I've got my I need income goals, how much I need to get by in retirement, maybe at the same lifestyle I have today. And then my I want goals, right? How much income I want to do all the extra fun things. And a lot of people will say, I want to have my I need goals covered through all insured items or all contractual items. And then the difference between the I need and the I want okay, if that's maybe a little bit more stock-based where dividends could get cut, maybe I'm okay with that, okay, because it's not cutting into the bone. So again, things you just have to think about and plan in advance of retirement.
Yeah. Well, there are plenty of other risks to your retirement, including inflation, which is really known as the retirement killer. So we're going to talk about how you can guard against inflation and, of course, why it's such a huge risk in retirement. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and you're listening to The Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
And welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels. And today we're talking all about risks to your retirement. And so far we focused more on investment risk, right? We focused on if your lump sum value drops, how it might affect you emotionally in retirement different from if you're still working. And frankly, how if you're engineering income from the withdrawal method, how that's even a bigger problem. But we also focused on the risk to your income, how some investments have a contractual income stream that they pay, and some have an income stream that can change or get cut or even get eliminated, right? But Sarah, there are other types of risk too when you're planning for retirement that affect your money, if not directly, but maybe indirectly.
Oh, yeah. And one of those big risks, Dave, is inflation, which is, we've called it the retirement killer because it could be difficult to plan for. It could be difficult to hedge against, and it can take a huge toll on your retirement, like I said, if you haven't planned for it.
Yeah, the silent killer. Call it the silent killer.
Yep.
It's like hypertension, right? Hypertension's the silent killer in the medical field. Inflation's the silent killer in retirement. And as we live longer, we have to contend more and more with inflation. So I'll share another story. I shared one story from a client of mine in the 1980s, right, just a minute ago, Ed, about who, just was so panicked going into retirement that even though it was obvious he had so much extra income that he just didn't feel comfortable. Well, another client of mine, same time in the 80s, I guess you get old enough, Sarah, in this industry, and you have a lot of stories, right?
Right.
This particular guy was from Hungary, and he was fixated by inflation, and he kept talking about inflation. And of course, our inflation was pretty much under control by the late 80s and into the 90s. So I couldn't understand why he was so fixated about this. And this is back when I was doing appointments in people's homes, right? So he said, hold on for a second. And he went back and took out a photo album. And the photo album was included in it currencies from Hungary during the World War, and how they had such hyperinflation that literally within the matter of a month, the $10 bills were obsolete. You needed a $100 bill. And a month later, the $100 bills were obsolete. You needed a $1,000 bill. And then you needed a $10,000 bill and a $100,000 bill. And he told me the story about how his dad owned a store during the World War and how he literally had to close the store to let his people, when they got paid, his employees go shopping. Because if they couldn't shop till the weekend, inflation would have eroded the value of that paycheck they just received. Wow. So inflation is important. But here's the thing, Sarah. Everybody thinks the best way to deal with inflation is to be more aggressive, to have more in stocks. Well, stocks don't do well in an inflationary market, right? Think last year, right? Last year we had inflation. The S&P 500 was down 20% almost, right? It was down more than the bond market. Everybody talks about, inflation isn't good for bonds. Interest rates going up isn't good for bonds. Well, the stock market dropped by more than the bond market. So that's not the best way to have inflation. Yeah. The best way to have inflation is to have more income than you need and be able to reinvest that income. We call it growing your money organically, growing your money the old-fashioned way, through the reinvestment of income.
And inflation, it doesn't just affect everything the same way. In fact, it can really affect the healthcare industry. Yeah. I can't remember what the statistic is, Dave, but I think it's like 2 or 3 times it exponentially increases healthcare inflation versus regular inflation. And that's kind of what our next Ask Dave question has to do with. So we have Karen from Mississippi. Karen says, between my husband and I, 3 out of 4 of our parents lived into the 90s and ended up needing to go into a nursing home. I think that I guess she means she and her husband, need to be more aggressive so I can afford healthcare later in life for both of us.
Okay, well, that's Karen, is it? Karen, yes. Karen, that's one way of doing it, to be more aggressive. But remember, there are other factors in that. If you're too aggressive, you're probably in stocks. You're probably not in dividend stocks. Okay, so let's say you need income. Well, now you're focusing on the withdrawal method, And the withdrawal method, as we had talked about earlier in the show, can backfire on you, right? If you end up in a bull market, you could spend on half your money in just a little more than a decade. So you've got to be careful there. But what if you don't need your money, right? Well, Karen, I'm sure a good part of your money is probably IRAs and 401ks. Well, at age 73, the government's going to force you to start taking required minimum distributions. And you're going to have a choice. That choice, and by the way, they're about 4% a year, and then they go up percentage-wise as you get older. And the government just wants you to take that withdrawal and pay the taxes on it. But you're going to have a choice. Can you set yourself up to earn enough interest and dividends so that you can just take the required minimum distribution, the government-forced withdrawal from the interest and dividend, and keep your principal intact? Or whether you're going to allow the government to force you to sell shares and withdraw principal, right? So in some ways, defense is the best offense. And when you get to that RMD age, especially for your IRAs and 401ks and the like, you need to make sure that you're earning enough interest and dividends to satisfy those minimum distributions. Because keeping your principal intact is the best defense for medical care down the road. Sarah, what you were referring to a minute ago was that in healthcare, inflation doubles about every 12 years. Okay, so, let's say if Karen's in her 60s, by the time she gets in her late 80s, it could be 4 times as much, right? So right now, Karen, full-time home health care might be $150,000 a year, could be $600,000 by the time you get in your late 80s and you need it. Okay, so right now you might have $1 million in your IRA, and you might think, okay, $150,000, I've got $1 million, I can afford full-time home health care for 7 years. Well, guess what? If you spent down half your IRA because those government-forced distributions, so now you have $500,000 left in your late 80s, and meanwhile, the cost of 1 year of full-time home health care is $600,000, you don't have 7 years anymore, you might have 7 months worth, right? So again, getting more aggressive in many cases is not the answer.
Well, Karen, thank you so much for sending in your question for Dave to answer. And if anyone has an Ask Dave question that you would like Dave to answer or a topic for a show you'd like him to cover on a future show, all you have to do is send us a message. You can send it via email to askdave@retirementincomesource. That's SOURCE.com. And we appreciate you spending your weekend here with us on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton. And today's show has pretty much covered all angles of risk when it comes to your investments, risks you might face of what happens if your principal or your lump sum is spent down versus risks to even your income, like if your wife or your husband dies and your Social Security is gone, what happens with your pensions. And I think that this inflation, this is another huge risk, especially healthcare inflation, Dave, when it comes to retirement, that people just are not thinking about right now because they're healthy, they're 10 years out from retirement. They're thinking about all the fun, exciting things they're going to do and not thinking about this.
Well, I would actually beg to differ, because this past year was probably the first time in a long time people thought about inflation.
It's a good point. All right.
What we've gone through.
Yeah.
But they don't know how to deal with inflation. They fall into the old myth that, well, stocks are a good inflation hedge. Well, no, they're not. They weren't a good inflation hedge last year when we had high inflation. Again, they did worse than bonds. Stocks were a terrible inflation hedge during the 1970s. We had hyperinflation, and the stock market was underwater for 16 years, right? Yeah. So the key is to have enough income so you don't need to spend it all. You can reinvest some of it, grow your money organically, and keep your principal intact. Because here's the thing, Sarah. I don't want people using the withdrawal method in their 60s or 50s or even 70s. But if you get well into your 80s and inflation starts to put a little chokehold on you and things get more difficult, then spending down a little bit of principal in your 80s isn't so bad. Yeah. But, so that's why you want to keep that principle intact. So diversification, okay? Let's wrap this up with diversification, because everyone knows they need to be diversified, right? So you need to diversify by stocks, bonds, cash, real estate. Okay? That's what most people know. But hopefully today our listeners learn that, hey, it's also about diversifying by income type, right? You have to diversify by contract. Some things have to be by contract. Some things could be non-contractual. They could be all contract if you're conservative, but you've got to diversify by how contractual or non-contractual your income is. Yep. Taxes, okay? We're spending money as a country like drunken sailors these days. Taxes, most people think taxes are going to go up, right? We're sitting here arguing about whether or not we're going to pass the debt ceiling, right? So if taxes go up, as most people think they will, you're exposed, right? If you've got $1 million sitting in an IRA or 401k and the government raises taxes by 10%, they just took $100,000 out of your pocket, right?
Yeah.
So you've got to diversify by tax type. It's important to have a balance between taxable investment accounts, tax-deferred investment accounts like IRAs and 401ks, and then tax-free accounts, like having a little bit of money in a Roth IRA, okay? So again, diversify by investment asset class, diversify by income assurance or lack of assurance, and diversify according to tax type.
It seems like if you do all of these things, Dave, you're basically going to diversify your risk, right? And almost help to minimize your risk because you're thinking ahead and spreading out what you're doing, diversifying. That's why it's a great idea to do that. So, well, thank you so much for listening to the Retirement Income Source. And if you enjoyed this show or maybe you want to listen to it again, all you have to do is check out our radio website. It's Retirement Income Source radioshow.com. All of our past episodes are there for you to listen to.
So thanks for joining us, and we really hope you'll join us again next week. I'm David Scranton, here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it is all about the income.